Grace Walker woke up that morning with only one desire: to see her son swear his commitment to public service. She didn't expect applause, she didn't expect recognition. But she also didn't expect to be humiliated, escorted out like an intruder, judged merely by the simple appearance she carried. What that young officer didn't know was that, beneath that long-sleeved blouse, there was a mark he should never have ignored. A mark that told a story of sacrifice, honor, and heroism on distant battlefields. And when the truth finally came out, in front of hundreds of people, everything changed. If this story touched you, leave your like, comment on how you felt, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories of American veterans who deserve to be told. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to the beginning. Grace Walker woke up that morning with her chest tight with pride. It wasn't a noisy pride, the kind that announces itself with big smiles and shouts of joy, but a quiet, deep feeling, like a river current that never stops running. She had waited months for that day, counting the days on the calendar hanging in the modest house where she raised her son alone. Today, Evan would swear his commitment to the Police Explorers program in the solemn ceremony that would mark the official start of his journey toward public service. And Grace would be there, as she always had been, even when the whole world seemed to conspire against them both. There was something sacred about that moment, something she couldn't put into words, but felt deep in her soul. The town was slowly waking up on that spring morning, with the golden sunlight touching the roofs of the small houses and the trunks of the old trees that lined the cracked asphalt streets. It was one of those towns where everyone knew everyone, where American flags fluttered on almost every porch, and where the sound of the national anthem still gave the elders chills. Children ran along the sidewalks in worn school uniforms. Merchants opened their shops with the same decades-old routine, and the church in the center of the square announced Sunday service with a bell that echoed far. Grace loved that place, despite everything. It was there that she had learned the meaning of community, of belonging, of values that are neither negotiated nor abandoned. She dressed simply, as was her custom. Faded jeans, a white long-sleeved blouse, and a pair of leather boots worn down by time. No heavy makeup, no flashy jewelry, nothing that screamed for attention. Grace wasn't like that. She had learned, over years of service and sacrifice, that a person's true value is not in what they wear, but in what they carry inside. And inside her, invisible to the eyes of those who walked past distracted on the street, was a past few people knew. There were healed wounds and invisible scars. There were memories of distant deserts, of wounded soldiers, of endless nights where life and death danced hand in hand under the sound of explosions. There was also a silent pride, the kind of pride that doesn't need medals pinned to the chest to be real. She grabbed the car keys and looked one last time in the mirror. Her brown eyes, still bright despite the accumulated tiredness, reflected a history she rarely told. Grace Walker was a war veteran, an ex-combat medic who had saved lives on the battlefield, who had held the trembling hands of young soldiers while praying softly for miracles. But no one in town knew exactly what she had lived through. She didn't talk about it. Not because she was ashamed, but because some stories are too heavy to be told in casual conversation. And because, deep down, Grace believed that true service doesn't need the spotlight. It happens in silence, in the shadows, away from cameras and applause. When she arrived at the police department headquarters, the parking lot was already full. Whole families walked toward the main entrance, children running ahead while parents carried flowers, cameras, and small flags. The red brick building, imposing and solid, seemed to carry the weight of decades of history. American flags fluttered on tall masts, the wind making them dance against the cloudless blue sky. In the inner courtyard, teenage cadets lined up in formation, nervous and proud at the same time, adjusting their uniforms under the watchful eyes of the officers. Grace stopped for an instant, observing it all, and felt her chest tighten again. That was Evan's world now. That was the path he had chosen, and she would support him until the end. She walked slowly, watching the other families. There were mothers crying with pride, fathers with puffed-out chests, grandparents holding flags as if they were sacred relics. There were veterans with embroidered caps, military unit T-shirts, jackets with patches that told stories without words. Grace recognized those kinds of people. They were people like her, who had served in silence and were now watching the next generation follow the same path. She smiled discreetly at some of them, receiving respectful nods in return. There was a sense of community there that transcended words, a mutual recognition that only those who have worn the uniform can understand. It was an invisible, yet deep, belonging. Grace didn't know, at that moment, that her day was about to change completely. She didn't know that, in a few minutes, her dignity would be tested in a way she never imagined. She didn't know that someone, driven by arrogance and inexperience, would try to humiliate her in front of everyone, judging her only by her appearance, knowing absolutely nothing about who she really was. Grace didn't know that a small detail, a mark engraved on her skin, would be the trigger for a dramatic turning point that would echo throughout that community. She didn't know any of that. She was there only as a mother, just as a simple woman who wanted to see her son grow and become a man of honor. But the truth is that Grace Walker was never just an ordinary mother. She was a veteran, a silent warrior, a woman who had faced hell and returned standing. And even if she didn't carry medals on her chest or patches on her shoulder, even if she didn't tell her stories out loud, her value was there, engraved on her soul, invisible but unshakable. There was something powerful in that discretion, something few could see at first glance. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She knew who she was. And deep down, that was all that mattered. But the world doesn't always respect what it can't see, and that's where the injustices begin. Grace walked toward the area reserved for cadets' families, watching Evan from afar. He was lined up with the other young people, face serious, posture straight, eyes shining with nervousness and determination. She felt a wave of love so strong it almost knocked her down. How many nights had she spent awake, worried about his future? How many times had she worked double shifts, sacrificed everything, just to ensure he had a chance to grow up right? How many times had she swallowed her own pride, her own pain, just so he would never lack anything? Grace wasn't perfect, but she had given her all. And now there, in that courtyard lit by the morning sun, she saw the fruit of all of it. Evan was becoming a man. And she was there to witness it. The silent question hung in the air, invisible but present, like a shadow trailing behind every hasty judgment. What happens when someone is judged only by appearance? What happens when an arrogant authority decides, without knowing the story behind that face, that someone doesn't deserve to be there? What happens when a person's true value is ignored, trampled, humiliated, simply because it's not visible at first glance? Grace didn't know, but she was about to find out. And the answer would come in a way she would never forget, because respect is not something you demand. It's something you earn. And sometimes, the hardest achievement is making others see what has always been there, invisible, just waiting to be recognized. Grace parked the car in a space at the back of the parking lot, far from the main entrance, as she always did. It wasn't for lack of options, but a conscious choice, an old habit she carried from her time in service. Always maintain a clear exit route, always observe the environment before committing to a position. She turned off the engine and stayed there for an instant, her hands still on the steering wheel, breathing deeply and watching the movement around her. Families walked quickly, children ran with small flags in hand, and the sound of animated conversations filled the air. Grace smiled discreetly. This was what she always wanted for Evan. A normal life, surrounded by good people, in a community that believed in solid values. She opened the car door and got out, adjusting her blouse and taking one more deep breath before starting to walk. The police department courtyard was full of people. Teenage cadets lined up in impeccable formation, nervous and focused, adjusting their uniforms under the watchful eyes of the responsible officers. Families occupied the designated seats, sitting in white chairs, lined up under the shade of old trees that surrounded the red brick building. American flags fluttered on tall masts, the red, white, and blue fabric dancing in the wind as if it were part of the ceremony itself. Grace observed it all with silent attention, engraving every detail in her memory. She knew that this was one of the moments Evan would remember for the rest of his life, and she wanted to be fully present, not just physically, but emotionally. She wanted him to know, without needing words, that she was there, proud, firm, supporting every step he took. Among the crowd, Grace recognized familiar faces. There was Mer Patterson, a Vietnam War veteran, sitting in the front row with the embroidered cap of the 101st Airborne Division. There was Mars Martinez, whose son had served in Afghanistan and now worked as a paramedic in the city. There were other veterans, some with military jackets covered in patches, others dressed simply like Grace, but all carrying that same look, the look of those who know the weight of service, the cost of freedom, the silence that comes after wars. Grace exchanged discreet nods with some of them, feeling part of an invisible brotherhood, a circle of people who don't need formal introductions to recognize each other. That was the beauty of that community. Mutual respect, shared honor, the collective memory of sacrifices that should never be forgotten. Evan was in the middle of the formation, the fifth row from left to right. Grace located him immediately, as she always did. It was a maternal instinct impossible to turn off, that ability to find her son in any crowd, no matter how large. He was serious, eyes fixed ahead, posture straight, hands firm along his body. Grace felt her chest tighten with pride. He had grown so much. He was no longer that little boy who woke up in the middle of the night with nightmares and ran to her room asking for protection. Now he was a young man, determined, brave, ready to follow the path of public service. She knew that this path wouldn't be easy. She knew he would face challenges, dangers, injustices. But she also knew he was prepared. Because she had prepared him. Because she had taught him, by her own example, what honor, integrity, and resilience meant. As she walked toward the area reserved for families, Grace noticed the presence of officers scattered throughout the courtyard. Some were talking among themselves, others supervising the cadets, others greeting guests and checking credentials. There was an atmosphere of solemnity in the air, a mixture of pride and responsibility that filled every corner of that place. Grace loved that kind of environment. It reminded her of the days of military ceremony, when discipline and honor met in carefully choreographed rituals. She had never participated in a civilian ceremony like that, but the emotional weight was the same. It was a rite of passage, a moment of transition between childhood and adult responsibility. It was the moment when young people made public commitments, in front of their families and their communities, to serve with integrity and courage. It was then that Grace noticed an officer who was different from the others. He was standing near the entrance to the reserved area, arms crossed, gaze rigid, posture tense. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with his uniform impeccably fitted and a shining badge pinned to his chest. There was something about him that drew attention, a kind of anxiety disguised as authority, as if he was trying to prove something to himself or to others. Grace didn't know it, but that man was Deputy Ryan Keller, newly promoted, and this was one of the first official events under his supervision. He was determined to do everything perfectly, to apply every protocol with maximum rigor, to show his superiors that he deserved the promotion. But that determination, mixed with inexperience and insecurity, was a dangerous combination. And Grace was about to find that out in the worst possible way. Keller observed everything around him with exaggerated attention, checking credentials, correcting positions, giving short, sharp orders to subordinates. He was the kind of authority who believes that respect is earned through rigidity, that discipline is synonymous with harshness, that being fair means being inflexible. Beside him stood Cadet Mason Green, a young officer in training, blonde, thin, clearly nervous and anxious to please. Green followed Keller like a shadow, obeying every order without questioning, without thinking, just carrying out what he was commanded. It was the classic dynamic between mentor and apprentice, but in that case, the mentor was teaching the wrong lessons, because authority without wisdom is just arrogance disguised. And arrogance, sooner or later, finds its limit. Grace didn't pay much attention to them initially. She was focused on finding her place among the families, on watching Evan, on soaking up every detail of that special morning. She walked slowly, smiling discreetly at other mothers, nodded to Mr. Patterson, and continued toward the white chairs arranged in organized rows. The morning sun touched her face. The wind carried the smell of flowers planted around the courtyard, and the sound of the national anthem began to play softly through the speakers installed on the columns of the building. It was a perfect moment, one of those moments that should be preserved in memory forever. Grace didn't know that, in a few minutes, that perfect moment would be interrupted in the most unfair way possible. Evan, from afar, managed to locate his mother among the families. He couldn't turn his head completely, because he was in formation, but he managed to see her out of the corner of his eye. Grace walking slowly, simple, discreet, but carrying that presence he always admired. He knew his mother was not like the other mothers. He knew she had lived through things he would never live through, that she had faced situations he could barely imagine. He knew she was strong, brave, resilient. But he also knew she never talked about it, never boasted, never used her past as a bargaining chip for respect. She simply was who she was, and that had always been enough for him. Evan felt a wave of pride wash over his chest. He was there, about to swear his commitment to public service, and all of it was because of her. Because of the example she always set, because of the values she always taught, because of the love she always showed, even in the most difficult moments. Grace finally reached the reserved area and stopped for an instant, looking at the chairs and trying to decide where to sit. She preferred to stay a little further back, away from the spotlight, away from the cameras that captured every moment for the families. She didn't need to stand out. She just needed to be there, present, supporting her son. It was at that moment that Deputy Ryan Keller looked in her direction. He saw her walking, simple, with no visible credential hanging around her neck, no uniform, nothing that immediately identified her as a cadet's family member. And something clicked inside him, something wrong. Something he interpreted as a failure of protocol. And it was exactly there, in that silent and seemingly insignificant instant, that everything began to fall apart. Because Keller, driven by excessive zeal and arrogance disguised as responsibility, decided that Grace Walker shouldn't be there. And he was about to do something that would completely change the course of that day. Grace took a few more steps toward the white chairs when she heard a firm voice behind her, sharp and impatient, breaking the respectful silence that hung over the courtyard. "Ma'am, you need to stop right there." Grace turned around slowly, confused, meeting Deputy Ryan Keller's hard gaze. He was a few feet away, arms crossed, chin raised, that posture that inexperienced authorities often adopt when they want to seem more intimidating than they really are. Grace blinked, not understanding exactly what was happening. She looked around, trying to identify if she had done something wrong, if she had entered a restricted area without realizing it. But no, she was exactly where all the other families were, walking toward the chairs designated for the cadets' families. There was nothing wrong there. At least, there shouldn't have been. "Excuse me, officer, is there a problem?" Grace asked politely, keeping her tone calm and respectful. She had learned, over the years, that the best way to deal with authority was always with respect, even when the authority was wrong. Keller took a step forward, his eyes scanning Grace from head to toe, as if he were assessing a potential threat. "Do you have a credential, ma'am?" he asked dryly, without even trying to disguise the distrust in his voice. Grace frowned slightly, but maintained her composure. "Credential? I'm the mother of one of the cadets. Evan Walker." She pointed discreetly toward the formation, where Evan was still lined up with the other young people. But Keller didn't even look. He had already decided, before even hearing the answer, that Grace shouldn't be there. And once a rigid mind makes a decision, it rarely goes back. "All family members received credentials in advance, ma'am. If you don't have yours, you'll need to go back to the reception desk and regularize the situation." Keller spoke with that bureaucratic and inflexible tone, as if reciting a procedure manual he had memorized word for word. Grace took a deep breath, trying to maintain her patience. She knew that this was a misunderstanding, knew that a quick conversation would be enough to resolve everything. "I did receive the credential. It's in my bag in the car. I didn't think it was necessary to wear it hanging all the time, as other families aren't using theirs either." She gestured discreetly to the other people around, many of whom had no visible credentials, but Keller didn't want to know. He had found a fault in the protocol, and now he had the opportunity to demonstrate authority. And for someone like him, insecure and eager to prove his worth, that opportunity was irresistible. "Ma'am, the protocol is clear. Without a visible credential, you cannot remain in this area. I'll need you to go back to the reception desk now," Keller said, raising his voice slightly, enough for some people around to start noticing the situation. Grace felt her face flush, not with anger, but with embarrassment. She didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to draw attention, especially on the most important day of her son's life. She looked quickly in Evan's direction, who was still in formation, but she knew he was probably noticing what was happening. That hurt her more than any harsh word from Keller. "Officer, I understand the protocol, but I can guarantee that I am the mother of one of the cadets. If you like, I can get the credential from the car right now. It will only take a few minutes." Grace tried one more time, keeping her voice low and respectful, trying to diffuse the situation. But Keller wasn't interested in solutions. He was interested in proving a point. He turned slightly and gave a hand signal. "Green, come here." Cadet Mason Green, who was standing a few feet away, approached quickly, nervous and anxious to obey. He was young, probably not even 20, blonde, thin, with that look of someone who is still learning to handle responsibility. He stopped next to Keller, looking alternately between the deputy and Grace, clearly not fully understanding what was happening. "Yes, sir," Green asked, swallowing hard. Keller pointed at Grace with his chin, without even looking directly at her, as if she were an administrative problem that needed to be resolved. "Escort this lady to the reception desk. She does not have a visible credential and needs to regularize the situation before returning," Keller said, firmly, almost robotically. Grace felt her heart sink. This was getting ridiculous. She looked at Green, who was clearly uncomfortable, but too obedient to question a direct order. "Please, officer, this isn't necessary. I can resolve this myself." Grace tried again, but Keller cut off any possibility of dialogue. "Ma'am, either you cooperate and go to the reception desk now, or I will need to call security to escort you. The choice is yours." The coldness in his voice was palpable. There was no compassion, no flexibility, no humanity. Just procedural rigidity taken to the extreme. Grace looked around and realized that several people were already watching. Whole families turned their heads in her direction, whispering among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. Mr. Patterson, the veteran from the 101st Airborne, frowned, clearly bothered by the way Grace was being treated. Other mothers exchanged confused looks. Grace took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. She didn't want to cause a scandal. She didn't want that moment to be remembered as the day Evan's mother caused a problem. So against all her instincts, against everything she believed about justice and dignity, she decided to give in. "All right. "I'll go to the reception desk," she said, softly, keeping her voice firm despite the humiliation burning inside. Keller nodded, satisfied with himself, as if he had just solved a major security problem. Green stepped to the side, indicating the way back to the main building. Grace looked once more in Evan's direction, and this time she managed to see his face. He was no longer looking ahead. He was looking directly at her, his eyes wide, worried, confused, clearly wanting to leave the formation and go to her, but he couldn't. He was in an official ceremony. And Grace knew that. She started walking back, followed by Green, who walked 2 steps behind, uncomfortable and silent. The courtyard, which had seemed so welcoming before, now seemed hostile. Every step Grace took seemed to echo, amplified by the unwanted attention that was now on her. She felt the stares, heard the whispers, perceived the confusion of the people around. Some families watched her with pity, others with curiosity, others with judgment. And all of this because of a credential that was just a few feet away, inside the car. All of this because of a misinterpreted protocol. All of this because of the arrogance of a man who knew absolutely nothing about who she really was. Grace pressed her lips together, holding back the tears that threatened to come. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to give Keller that satisfaction. As she walked, Grace felt the anger begin to grow inside her, but it wasn't an explosive anger. It was a silent, controlled anger, the kind that comes from years of discipline and self-control. She had faced much worse situations than that. She had held wounded soldiers in her arms as they agonized in the desert. She had made life-or-death decisions in split seconds. She had served her country with honor, dedication, and sacrifice. And now there, in her own community, at an event that should be a source of pride and celebration, she was being publicly humiliated by an officer who didn't know even half of what she had already lived through. The irony was cruel. But Grace knew that the truth always comes out. Always. She just didn't know that that truth would come out in such a dramatic way. Keller stood still where he was, watching Grace walk away. He crossed his arms again, satisfied with himself, believing he had done his duty. He had no idea of the mistake he had just made. He had no idea who Grace Walker really was. He had no idea that, in a few minutes, that situation would turn against him in a way he would never forget. Because true authority doesn't come from a shiny badge pinned to the chest. True authority comes from character, from service rendered, from honor earned in silence. And Grace Walker had more moral authority in a single finger than Keller would have in his entire career, but he still didn't know that. He still felt in control. He still believed he had done the right thing. And that illusion was about to be completely destroyed. Grace walked down the corridor of the main building, closely followed by Cadet Mason Green, who maintained a respectful but watchful distance, as if carrying out an important order. The silence between them was heavy, embarrassing, punctuated only by the sound of footsteps echoing against the old linoleum floor. Grace looked ahead, her jaw locked, trying to keep her dignity intact despite the humiliation burning inside. She had faced scorching deserts, firefights in war zones, soldiers dying in her arms, and now she was being escorted like a suspect inside a public building on the most important day of her son's life. The irony was bitter, almost unbearable. But she knew that exploding, reacting with anger or despair, would only make the situation worse. So she took a deep breath, counted to 10 mentally, and kept walking, one step at a time, keeping her head high. Outside, in the courtyard, the ceremony continued getting ready. The national anthem began to play through the speakers, and the family stood up, hands over their hearts, eyes turned toward the flag fluttering on the mast. Evan was in formation, but his mind was far away. He had seen everything. He had seen Deputy Keller intercept his mother. He had seen the discussion. He had seen her being forced back into the building. And that was eating him up inside. He wanted to break formation, run over there, defend his mother, demand an explanation. But he couldn't. He was in an official ceremony, and breaking formation would mean disrespecting everything he had learned in recent months. It would mean disrespecting the values his own mother had taught: discipline, respect, self-control. So he stood still, but his fists were clenched so tightly that his nails dug into the palms of his hands. Back in the courtyard, Sergeant Tom Harrington was observing everything from afar. He was a veteran of over 20 years of service, gray hair, a tired but perceptive look, the kind of man who had seen everything and was not fooled by appearances. He was standing near the entrance to the ceremonial area, supervising the final preparations, when he noticed the commotion involving Keller and Grace. Initially, he didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just a routine administrative matter. But something about that woman caught his attention. The way she moved, the straight posture even under pressure, the firm gaze despite the embarrassment. Harrington knew that kind of posture. It was the posture of someone who had served, of someone who had faced much worse situations than a misinterpreted protocol. He frowned, trying to remember if he had seen that woman before, but couldn't identify her. Still, something inside him set off an alert. Harrington took a few steps in Keller's direction, who was still standing where he had intercepted Grace, now talking to another officer, clearly satisfied with himself. "Keller," Harrington called out, firm but not aggressive. Keller turned immediately, straightening his posture, trying to look professional. "Yes, Sergeant?" Harrington pointed discreetly toward the corridor where Grace had disappeared. "What happened over there?" Keller took a deep breath, preparing to justify his action. "An unauthorized civilian without a visible credential trying to access the reserved area, Sergeant. I applied the protocol and asked her to regularize the situation at the reception desk." Harrington nodded slowly, but something about the explanation didn't convince him. "Did she say who she was?" Keller hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "She said she was the mother of one of the cadets, but didn't present a credential. The protocol is clear, Sergeant. No visible credential, no access." Harrington observed Keller for a long moment, trying to decide whether to intervene or let it go. Meanwhile, Grace finally arrived at the reception desk. It was a small room, with dark wood counters and administrative staff organizing papers and checking lists. A middle-aged woman, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, looked up when Grace approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, polite but direct. Grace took a deep breath before speaking. "I was directed to come here to regularize my credential. I'm the mother of one of the cadets, Evan Walker, but I left the credential in the car." The employee frowned, confused. "You don't need to wear the credential hanging all the time. Just present it at the entrance." "Have you already passed the entrance?" Grace nodded. "Yes, I did. I presented it at the entrance and put it away in my bag." The employee seemed even more confused. "Then what's the problem?" Grace felt the frustration growing, but kept her tone calm. "Deputy Keller said I needed to have the credential visible all the time. He asked me to come here to regularize the situation." The employee sighed, clearly tired of this kind of situation. She had seen overly zealous officers enforcing protocols in an exaggerated way before, and it always created unnecessary confusion. "I'll check the list of registered family members." "What is your full name?" "Grace Walker." The employee typed the name into the computer, checked for a few seconds, and nodded. "It's here. Grace Walker, mother of Evan Walker, program cadet. You are duly registered and authorized to participate in the ceremony. There is no need to wear the credential hanging, only to present it at the entrance, which you have already done." Grace felt a momentary relief, but also a growing anger. She had been publicly humiliated for nothing, for a wrong interpretation of a protocol that didn't even exist the way Keller had claimed. "So I can go back to the courtyard?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice firm. The employee nodded affirmatively. "Of course, you are fully authorized. I apologize for the inconvenience." Grace turned to leave, but stopped for an instant. She looked at her left arm, where the long sleeve covered the tattoo she rarely showed. It was a small but significant tattoo, the symbol of the combat medics, with the intertwined serpent and the wings, accompanied by the initials of her unit. She had gotten it years ago, right after returning from Afghanistan, as a way to honor the comrades who didn't return. It was a personal, intimate mark that she didn't display around like a trophy. But at that moment, as she walked back to the courtyard, she decided to roll up her sleeves. Not out of arrogance, not out of a desire for confrontation, but as a matter of principle. She wasn't going to hide who she was. She wasn't going to allow Keller's humiliation to make her feel lesser. She was a veteran, she had served her country, and she didn't owe anyone an explanation for her presence at that ceremony. When Grace returned to the courtyard, the atmosphere had changed. The ceremony was about to officially begin, and Chief Patrick O'Connor was taking the stage to give the welcoming remarks. Keller was standing near the entrance to the reserved area, talking to Green when he saw Grace returning. He frowned, surprised and slightly annoyed. He had expected her to take longer, perhaps even miss part of the ceremony. But there she was, walking back with the same dignified posture as before, only now with her sleeves rolled up. Keller took a step forward, preparing to intercept her again, but something made him stop. He looked at her arm and saw the tattoo, the symbol of the combat medics, the wings, the serpent, the initials. And he froze, completely, as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. Because at that moment, everything became clear. He hadn't just humiliated a random civilian. He had just humiliated a war veteran. Keller swallowed hard, his face losing color. He tried to move, but couldn't. His eyes remained fixed on the tattoo, and his mind began to process the implications of what he had done. Sergeant Harrington, who was still observing from afar, also saw the tattoo. And at that instant, everything made sense to him. The posture, the gaze, the dignity under pressure. Grace Walker was a combat medic, a veteran. And Keller, in his arrogance and excessive zeal, had just made a very serious mistake. Harrington felt the anger rise, but also the urgency to act. He knew that couldn't stand. It needed to be corrected. Immediately, he turned and started walking quickly toward Lieutenant Charles Morgan, who was coordinating the ceremony logistics, because this was no longer an administrative matter. It was a matter of honor. And honor in their community was non-negotiable. Grace continued walking, completely ignoring Keller, who remained frozen where he was. She found a discreet spot among the families and sat down, looking in Evan's direction. He located her immediately, and their eyes met. Grace nodded discreetly, trying to reassure him, saying without words that everything was okay. Evan slightly relaxed his shoulders, but still looked tense, worried. Grace smiled, small but genuine, and turned her attention to the stage, where Chief O'Connor was beginning to speak. But she knew that this was not over yet. She could feel the stares, could perceive the movement around her, could see Harrington talking urgently with Morgan. Something was about to happen. And this time, the truth would come out. Completely. Sergeant Tom Harrington walked quickly across the courtyard, dodging families and officers, his eyes fixed on Lieutenant Charles Morgan, who was standing near the stage, supervising the final adjustments for the ceremony. Harrington felt his chest tighten with anger and concern. He had served long enough to know when something was wrong, and this was very wrong. A veteran had been publicly humiliated by an arrogant officer who knew absolutely nothing about who she was. And if he didn't act fast, this would become a much bigger problem than a simple misunderstanding. He quickened his pace, reaching Morgan's side and lightly touching his shoulder. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you." "It's urgent." Morgan turned, frowning, surprised by the urgency in Harrington's voice. He had known the sergeant for years and knew that Harrington was not the type to raise unnecessary alarms. "What happened, Tom?" Morgan asked, instinctively lowering his voice. Harrington took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. Keller just removed the woman from the reserved area, claiming a lack of visible credential. He escorted her to the reception desk, in front of everyone, publicly humiliating her. Single quotes. Morgan frowned even more, but didn't seem alarmed. What's the problem? If she didn't have a credential, Keller was following protocol. Harrington shook his head, frustrated. No, sir. She had a credential. She's the mother of one of the cadets. And there's more. Single quotes. He paused, letting the weight of the information sink in. She's a combat medic, a war veteran. I saw the tattoo on her arm, and Keller saw it too. He's frozen over there, probably just realizing the mess he made. Morgan felt his blood run cold. He didn't say anything for a long moment, processing the implications of that. Morgan quickly looked in the direction where Keller was standing, saw the pale deputy, looking at the ground, clearly in shock. He turned back to Harrington. Are you sure? Harrington nodded. Absolutely, sir. Combat medic symbol, wings, serpent, unit initials. I know that tattoo. She served. And we just treated her like a security threat. Morgan closed his eyes for an instant, feeling the frustration grow. He knew exactly what that meant. Veterans were sacred in that community. They were respected, honored, protected. Humiliating a veteran, especially at a public event like that, was unacceptable. And if the news spread, if the families found out what had happened, the reputation of the entire department would be at stake. He needed to act, fast. Where is she now? Morgan asked, urgently. Harrington pointed discreetly to the reserved area. She came back. She's sitting over there, among the families. Morgan took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He knew he couldn't just ignore it. He needed to inform Chief O'Connor immediately, because this was no longer a matter he could resolve alone. It needed to be corrected from the top of the hierarchy, publicly, in the same way the injustice had been committed. Tom, stay here. Don't let Keller do anything until I get back. I'm going to talk to the chief now. Harrington nodded, feeling a momentary relief that someone was taking charge of the situation. Morgan turned and walked quickly toward the backstage of the stage, where Chief Patrick O'Connor was reviewing his opening speech. The chief was a man in his 60s, completely white hair, firm posture, serious but fair gaze. He had served in the department for over 40 years and was respected by the entire community. Morgan knew he would take this seriously. Chief, I apologize for interrupting, but we have an urgent situation, Morgan said, quietly but firmly. O'Connor raised his eyes from the paper, immediately attentive. He had known Morgan for years and knew the lieutenant wouldn't interrupt him without a good reason. Speak. Morgan took a deep breath and explained everything. Grace's interception, the public humiliation, the credential she had, the combat medic tattoo, Keller's mistake, Harrington's reaction. O'Connor listened to everything in silence, his face growing increasingly tense, his jaw locked. When Morgan finished, the chief closed his eyes for an instant, breathing deeply, controlling the anger he clearly felt. Where is this woman now? O'Connor asked, his voice low but carrying authority. In the reserved area, sir. She returned after regularizing the situation at the reception desk. O'Connor nodded slowly, processing everything. And Keller? Still in the courtyard, sir. Frozen. He saw the tattoo. O'Connor shook his head, frustrated and disappointed. The chief remained silent for a few seconds, thinking about the best way to handle it. He knew he couldn't let it go. He knew it needed to be corrected, publicly, immediately. Veterans were the backbone of that community. They had sacrificed everything for the country, and the least the department could do was treat them with the respect and dignity they deserved. And Keller, in his arrogance and inexperience, had completely failed in that. What is her name? O'Connor asked. Grace Walker, sir. Mother of Cadet Evan Walker. O'Connor repeated the name mentally, engraving it. He looked at Morgan firmly. Bring Julia here. I want her to access the records and give me all the information about Grace Walker. Military service, unit, period of duty, everything. And I want it in 5 minutes. Morgan nodded and quickly left to find Julia Reynolds, the chief's executive assistant, who had access to all administrative records. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Keller finally managed to move. He looked around, desperate, trying to find a way to correct what he had done without drawing more attention. But it was too late. Harrington was standing a few feet away, looking directly at him with an expression that mixed disappointment and anger. Keller swallowed hard and took a few steps toward the sergeant, trying to find words, trying to justify the unjustifiable. "Sergeant, I didn't know." Harrington raised his hand, cutting him off. "Stop, you don't say anything now. You stand still and wait. The chief has been informed. He will deal with this." Keller felt his stomach sink. If the chief was involved, it meant this was serious. Very serious. He looked in Grace's direction, who was sitting calmly among the families, looking at the stage as if nothing had happened. But Keller knew something had happened. And he knew this was far from over. Julia Reynolds quickly arrived backstage, carrying a tablet. She was a woman in her 40s, efficient, organized, with years of experience in administrative management. O'Connor greeted her with a nod and went straight to the point. "Julia, I need all the information on Grace Walker. Military service, history, unit, period of duty. Everything you can find." Julia frowned, but didn't question. She started typing on the tablet, accessing the military databases that the department was authorized to consult. It took her less than 3 minutes to find what she needed. When the data appeared on the screen, she read in silence for a few seconds, her eyes widening slightly. She looked at the chief seriously. Grace Walker. Combat medic, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team. Served in Afghanistan, 2012 to 2014. Awarded the Bronze Star Medal and the Purple Heart. Honored for saving lives under enemy fire. Julia paused. "Sir, she is a hero." O'Connor felt his chest tighten. Not with anger, but with deep respect. He had served in the Air Force in the 80s and knew exactly what a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart meant. Grace Walker was not just a veteran. She was one of the best. She had risked her own life to save others. And Keller, in his arrogance, had treated her like an intruder. The chief shook his head, took a deep breath, and made his decision. "Julia, come with me. Morgan, Harrington, you too. We are going to correct this now." He turned and started walking toward the courtyard, with the 3 following him. O'Connor was not a man of half measures or empty gestures. When he decided to do something, he did it completely. And at that moment, he was about to do something that entire community would remember for a long time. Because honor is not just a word, it is an action. And it was time to act. Grace was sitting calmly, watching the stage, when she noticed a different kind of movement. Chief Patrick O'Connor was descending from the stage, accompanied by Morgan, Harrington, and Julia Reynolds. He walked with purpose, directly, firmly, his eyes fixed on someone. And then Grace realized. He was walking toward her. The families around began to notice too, turning their heads, whispering, trying to understand what was happening. Evan, information, saw everything and felt his heart race. Grace remained seated, breathing deeply, not knowing exactly what to expect. The chief stopped in front of her, looked directly into her eyes, and then, to everyone's surprise, he gave a perfect military salute. Firm, respectful, honorable. And at that moment, everything changed, completely. Grace immediately stood up, almost by instinct, returning the salute with the same dignity and respect she had always shown during her years of service. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected Chief Patrick O'Connor, the highest authority in the police department, to come to her and honor her in that way, in front of hundreds of people. The entire courtyard fell silent. Conversations ceased, whispers stopped. Even the cadets in formation slightly turned their heads, trying to understand what was happening. The chief held the salute for a few seconds, firm and respectful, and only then lowered his hand. He looked directly into Grace's eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of authority and respect that resonated throughout the courtyard. "Ma'am, it is an honor to have you with us today," he said, firm but genuine. Grace felt her eyes well up, but she controlled the tears. She nodded, unable to speak at that moment. O'Connor turned slightly, gesturing for Julia Reynolds to approach. She held the tablet firmly and walked until she was beside the chief, ready to provide the necessary information. The chief looked quickly at the families around, at the officers, at the cadets, and then returned his attention to Grace. "Ladies and gentlemen," O'Connor began, raising his voice enough for everyone to hear, "I ask for everyone's attention for a moment. I want you to meet someone who is among us today." He paused, letting the silence settle. "This woman, Grace Walker, is not just the mother of one of our cadets. She is a war veteran, a combat medic who served in the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team in Afghanistan from 2012 to 2014. The courtyard remained in absolute silence. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Evan, in formation, felt his chest swell with pride and emotion. He knew his mother had served, but he had never heard the full details like that, publicly, with that weight and that honor. O'Connor continued, now looking at everyone around. Not just Grace. Grace Walker was decorated with the Bronze Star Medal for acts of heroism in combat. She also received the Purple Heart for wounds suffered in action. He paused again, letting the words sink in. She saved lives under enemy fire. She risked her own life to protect her comrades. She is a hero in the truest and deepest sense of the word. The courtyard remained in absolute silence, but now the faces of the families had changed. There was no more confusion or curiosity. There was respect. There was admiration. There were even tears in the eyes of some mothers who perfectly understood the weight of that sacrifice. M.R. Patterson, the veteran from the 101st Airborne, slowly stood up from his chair and began to clap. Strong, respectful, honorable. And then, one by one, the other families began to do the same. The applause grew, filling the courtyard, echoing off the walls of the red brick building, turning into a standing ovation. Grace felt the tears finally run down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness or humiliation. They were tears of recognition, of validation, of respect finally received. She looked around, seeing hundreds of faces applauding, smiling, honoring her. She looked at Evan, who was in formation with eyes shining with pride, his chin trembling with emotion. And at that moment, everything that had happened before, all the humiliation, all the injustice, seemed to disappear. Because the truth had prevailed, honor had been restored, and justice had been done, publicly, in the same way the injustice had been committed. O'Connor waited until the applause began to die down, and then raised his hand, asking for silence again. The families calmed down, sitting slowly, all eyes fixed on the chief, waiting to hear what he would say next. O'Connor turned slightly, now looking in the direction of Deputy Ryan Keller, who was standing a few feet away, pale, trembling, clearly in shock. The chief didn't need to call his name. He simply made a firm gesture with his hand, indicating that Keller should approach. Keller swallowed hard, feeling his legs weaken, but he obeyed. He walked slowly, under the weight of hundreds of judging eyes, until he stopped in front of the chief. O'Connor looked at him with an expression that mixed disappointment and firmness. There was no explosive anger, no shouting, but there was something much worse, deep disappointment. "Deputy Keller," O'Connor began, his voice low but loaded with authority. "You publicly humiliated a war veteran today. You treated her as if she were an intruder, without even having the decency to hear what she had to say. You applied a protocol rigidly and mistakenly, without using common sense, without showing respect, without exercising the compassion that this community expects from its officers. Keller opened his mouth to try to justify himself, but the chief raised his hand, cutting off any attempt to speak. "Stop. You listen." O'Connor took a step closer, looking directly into Keller's eyes. "The authority you carry is not a right. It is a responsibility. And with that responsibility comes the obligation to treat all people with dignity and respect, especially those who have served our country." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You failed at that today. You failed this woman, you failed this community, and you failed me." The silence in the courtyard was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke, everyone observing that moment of public correction. Keller felt his face burn with shame, but he didn't dare look away. He knew he deserved every word of it. He knew he had deeply erred, and there was no excuse that could justify what he had done. O'Connor took a deep breath before continuing. "Starting now, you will undergo additional training on protocol, community sensitivity, and respect for veterans. You will also be formally reprimanded in your record. And I hope, Deputy Keller, that you learn from this. Because if you don't learn to exercise authority with humility and respect, you have no place in this department." Keller nodded, his voice failing when he tried to respond. "Yes, sir, I am sorry, sir." O'Connor nodded, but did not verbally accept the apology. He simply turned back to Grace, making it clear that the conversation with Keller was over. "Ma'am," O'Connor said, returning his attention to Grace, "on behalf of the entire police department, I apologize for the treatment you received today. This should never have happened. And I guarantee you that we will take steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." Grace nodded, her voice still failing, but managing to say softly, "Thank you, Chief." O'Connor then did something no one expected. He turned to the audience and made an inviting gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Grace Walker to sit in the area of honor alongside the authorities during this ceremony. She more than deserves this place." The audience erupted in applause again, this time even louder. Grace felt her heart race, but nodded discreetly, accepting the honor. Julia Reynolds approached, genuinely smiling, and guided Grace to the area of honor, where a chair was quickly prepared for her. Grace sat down, still processing everything that had just happened, feeling finally seen, finally respected, finally honored in the way she always deserved. Evan, in formation, couldn't hold back the tears. He cried openly, proud, emotional, knowing that this was one of the most important moments not only of his life, but of his mother's life too. Because finally, after years of silent service, after years of unrecognized sacrifice, Grace Walker was being publicly honored, and that was justice in its purest form. O'Connor returned to the stage, preparing to continue the ceremony, but before starting, he looked once more at the courtyard and said, firm and clear, "Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, that true honor is not in the uniform we wear today, but in the character we carry and the service we render." Grace Walker taught us that today, and I hope that all of us, especially our young cadets, carry that lesson for the rest of their lives. The audience applauded once more, and then, finally, the official ceremony began. But everyone there knew that that day would be remembered not only for the cadets' graduation, but for the moment when justice prevailed, when honor was restored, and when a war veteran was finally recognized in the way she always deserved. And Keller, standing aside, knew that that was a lesson he would never, ever forget. The ceremony continued with a renewed solemnity. The national anthem played through the speakers, and every person in the courtyard placed their hand over their heart, looking at the flag proudly fluttering on the mast. Grace, now seated in the area of honor alongside the authorities, felt a deep and unprecedented emotion. She had participated in hundreds of military ceremonies over her years of service, but this one was different. This one was personal. This one was about her son, about his journey, about the moment he would officially become part of something greater than himself. She looked at Evan in formation, and he looked back, his eyes still shining with emotion. Mother and son exchanged a discreet smile, one of those smiles that says everything without needing words. And at that moment, Grace knew that everything she had been through, all the sacrifice, all the pain, all the struggle, had been worth it. Because Evan was there, strong, dignified, ready to serve. The cadets began to be called one by one to the stage to receive their certificates and take the official oath. Each name was announced clearly, followed by respectful applause from the families. Grace watched everything attentively, eagerly waiting for the moment Evan's name would be called. She saw other young people going up to the stage, nervous but proud, saluting Chief O'Connor, receiving the certificate, and then returning to the formation. Each one of them carried in their eyes that mixture of fear and determination that Grace knew so well. It was the look of someone who was about to enter a difficult path, but who consciously chose that path, knowing the risks, knowing the responsibilities. And Grace respected each of them for that. Because choosing to serve, in any form, is always an act of courage. And those young people, even if inexperienced, had already demonstrated that courage by being there. Finally, Evan's name was called. Cadet Evan Walker. The officer in charge's voice echoed through the courtyard, firm and clear. Grace felt her heart leap in her chest. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on her son, wanting to engrave every second of that moment in her memory. Evan took a step forward, leaving the formation, and began to walk toward the stage. His posture was straight, shoulders back, chin raised, exactly as Grace had taught years ago when he was still a child and played soldier in the backyard. She remembered those days, how he ran through the house with an improvised flag, pretending he was saving the world. And now there, he was no longer pretending. He was truly entering the path of service. Grace felt the tears return, but this time she didn't hold them back. She let them flow freely, without shame, without fear, because those were tears of pure pride. Evan climbed the stage steps and stopped in front of Chief Patrick O'Connor. He gave the salute, firm and respectful, keeping his gaze fixed ahead. O'Connor smiled discreetly and returned the salute. He took the certificate from Julia Reynolds' hands and handed it to Evan, firmly shaking his hand immediately afterward. "Congratulations, Cadet Walker. Your mother must be very proud of you," O'Connor said quietly, just for Evan to hear. Evan nodded, his voice failing a little when he replied, "Thank you, sir, and yes, she is. I am proud of her too." O'Connor smiled again, wider this time, and patted Evan's shoulder before releasing him. Evan descended from the stage, returning to the formation, but now carrying something extra, not just a certificate, but the certainty that he was doing the right thing, following the path his mother had paved with her own example. When all the cadets had been called and all the certificates handed out, it was time for the collective oath. The young people lined up in perfect formation, looking ahead, right hands raised, ready to make the official commitment to the program and the community. Chief O'Connor went up to the stage again, holding a paper with the text of the oath, and his voice echoed through the courtyard with authority and solemnity. "Repeat after me," he began slowly. "I swear, by my honor and the honor of my family, to serve this community with integrity, courage, and compassion. I swear to respect the law, protect the innocent, and defend the values that make this nation great. I swear never to abuse the authority entrusted to me, and always to act with justice, even when it is difficult. I swear this before God, before my community, and before those who love me." The cadets repeated every word, their voices uniting in a powerful chorus that seemed to vibrate in the air. Grace heard every word of that oath and felt its deep weight. She knew that those words were not just a formality. They were a real commitment, a promise that, if taken seriously, would shape the rest of those young people's lives. She had also taken an oath years ago when she entered military service. And she had honored that oath until the end, even when it was difficult, even when it cost dearly. And now, seeing her son make the same kind of promise, She felt a deep and emotional connection with that moment. It was as if a cycle was being completed. As if everything she had lived through, all the sacrifice, had led up to that point. Up to that instant when Evan committed to following the same path of service and honor she had trod. And that, for Grace, was the greatest reward she could have received. Not medals, not applause, but knowing that her son had learned the right values. The ceremony concluded with another round of applause, and the cadets were released to reunite with their families. Evan ran immediately toward Grace, who was already standing, waiting for him with open arms. They hugged tightly, without saying anything, just feeling the emotion of the moment. Grace held her son's face with both hands, looking directly into his eyes, and said, her voice choked, "I am so proud of you, Evan. So proud." Evan smiled, tears streaming down his face. "I'm proud of you too, Mom. Always have been. And today, everyone here knows who you really are." Grace laughed softly, emotional, and hugged her son again. Around them, other families reunited, celebrating, taking pictures, commemorating that important day. But for Grace and Evan, the rest of the world seemed to have disappeared. At that moment, there were only the two of them, mother and son, united by love, respect, and mutual pride. As the families began to disperse, many people approached Grace. M.R. Patterson was one of the first, extending his hand firmly and saying, "Ma'am, it was an honor to meet you today. Thank you for your service." Grace shook his hand, emotional, and replied, "Thank you, sir." "And thank you for your service, too." Other families approached, some just to greet her, others to hear stories, others simply to express gratitude. Grace received everyone with humility and kindness, without arrogance, without showing off. She hadn't done all that for recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. But now, receiving that recognition, she realized how much it meant. How much difference it made to be seen, to be respected, to be honored. And that filled her with a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. A peace that came from knowing that her past had not been forgotten, that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Deputy Ryan Keller remained distant throughout the ceremony, observing from afar, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had made a grave mistake, and he knew it. He had judged someone without knowing absolutely anything about who she was. He had applied protocols rigidly and inhumanly, without exercising compassion or common sense. And he had learned, in the hardest way possible, that authority without humility is just disguised tyranny. When the ceremony ended, the families began to disperse. Keller finally mustered the courage to approach Grace. He walked slowly, nervous, mentally rehearsing what he would say. When he reached her, he stopped, took a deep breath, and said, his voice low and genuinely regretful, "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize. Truly, I was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you that way. And I will carry this lesson for the rest of my career." Grace looked at him for a long moment, assessing the sincerity in his words. And then she nodded, accepting the apology. "I accept your apology, Deputy. And I hope you truly learned from this. Because authority is a responsibility, not a right." The story of Grace Walker quickly spread through the town. In the following days, local newspapers published stories about the veteran who had been unjustly humiliated and then publicly honored. Social media shared the account, and the entire community came to know her name. But Grace didn't change. She continued living her simple life, working, taking care of the house, supporting her son. Because for her, true service was always silent. True value was always internal. And true honor was always a matter of character, not public recognition. But now, whenever she walked through the town streets, people greeted her with respect. Veterans recognized her and gave discreet salutes. Children pointed to her and said, "That's the hero." And Grace smiled, humble, knowing that the greatest victory was not the recognition, but having lived according to her values, even when no one was looking. Because in the end, true honor doesn't need an audience. It exists in silence, in integrity, and in service rendered without expectation of return. And Grace Walker had mastered that art a long time ago.